Picture a situation that's so disastrous it caused a country's population to plummet by almost 8 million people in 10 years. While such a statistic seems nearly unimaginable, it is sadly very real, and it relates to the almost apocalyptic state of decline that the country of Venezuela entered into in the period beginning in 2013. At the helm of it all, perched atop a crumbling country and a system which continues to fail its citizens, sits Nicolás Maduro, the one-time bus driver turned most powerful man in a country which was once one of the wealthiest in Latin America and is now one of its poorest. Venezuela has been in the news for its economic woes for a large part of the last decade, and just as it appeared to have faded from view, it was hauled back into the world's attention in December 2023 when that same leader made some wild claims threatening a neighboring country with invasion, a topic we discussed in some length at the time. So today, we thought we'd explore just how this all fits together. Who is Nicolás Maduro? What is the recent history of Venezuela? And just how did things get so bad over there? Okay, before we get there, a little bit of context on Venezuela's current president. Nicolás Maduro Moros was born into a working-class family with leftist political leanings in the Venezuelan capital Caracas in 1962. Similar to other prominent leaders that we've already covered, Maduro's early life is shrouded in a little mystery and debate, with some speculation that he was actually born in neighboring Colombia, his mother's home country, 1 year earlier. That's a significant claim since, according to the Venezuelan constitution, the president must be a Venezuelan citizen from birth, and this could therefore have made Maduro ineligible to assume the presidency if true. A young Maduro was said to be academically mediocre, but politically expedient, becoming a class leader in Liceo Jose Avalos, the high school he attended in his hometown district of El Valle. He didn't graduate high school and became a bus driver, continuing his political activism, and became, at some point, a trade union leader for public transport employees in the capital region. Maduro was drawn to Hugo Chavez, future president of Venezuela, as the latter made his first foray into political action, and he became a member of the Bolivarian Revolution Movement, or MBR 200, in the early 1990s. Maduro supported Chavez when he attempted a coup d'etat against the state in 1992, and became a key member of Chavez's apparatus when he did eventually become president in 1999. During Chavez's 14 years as president, Maduro occupied several key government positions. He became president of the National Assembly of Venezuela in 2005 and Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2006. All this despite having no academic qualifications other than a one-year course in political education received at an institution for aspiring communists in Cuba in the mid-1980s. Nevertheless, Maduro was seen as having assumed his charge at the very helm of Venezuelan diplomacy competently. During his 6 years at the helm of the ministry, he fostered a network of diplomatic relations intended to strengthen Venezuela's ties with countries on poor terms with the United States, as well as regional powers in Central and South America, especially those with leftist governments such as Cuba, Bolivia, and Brazil. During this time, he also displayed devoted loyalty to Chavez, something which would pay dividends as he would assume the role of vice president in 2012 before ultimately succeeding Chavez as the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on the 5th of March 2013. But while Maduro's rise to power was punctuated by a series of often quite rapid successes, his presidency would be met immediately by a stark dose of reality. An economy in freefall, massive instability, hyperinflation, mass emigration, and massive protests indicative of a society brought to its very knees. So, before we get to Maduro's presidency and the context under which it has unfolded, it is important to dive here into what has made Venezuela's economic situation so torrid, and why the years of Maduro's reign have been so disastrous in Venezuela. What's important to recall is that the decisions which led to Venezuela's well-documented economic collapse in the mid-2010s are not necessarily Maduro's or even Chavez's doing, at least not entirely. Rather, they're the result of a stream of decisions made by Venezuelan leaders over practically the length of the 20th century. At the heart of it all lies oil, the country's most valuable resource, its largest export, and in some ways, the source of all of its misery. Venezuela discovered vast oil reserves in the early 1900s. These oil reserves were, and remain, by some margin, the very largest in the world. According to OPEC data, Venezuela has proven reserves of around 303 billion barrels of oil, putting it far ahead of next-placed Saudi Arabia at 260 billion proven barrels. Successive Venezuelan governments capitalized on this oil wealth, resulting in Venezuela soon becoming widely classified as both a rentier state and a petrostate. And Venezuela's oil money certainly did lend itself to some good times. In the 1950s, with much of the world ravaged by the Second World War, Venezuela was the fourth richest country in the world by GDP per capita, eclipsed only by the United States, Switzerland, and New Zealand. But the good times could not last. You see, while oil made Venezuela one of the richest countries in the world, it also brought a string of problems, including two potentially lethal ones for the country's stability. The first was rampant and routine corruption by state leaders of practically every political orientation, along with massive embezzlement of oil profits throughout much of this period of affluence. The second was an economic phenomenon which befell Venezuela, known shorthand as Dutch disease. Dutch disease is a circumstance where a country becomes so dependent on a given resource that it causes all other industries to become neglected, thereby increasing the country's dependence on that one resource even further. The term was coined by The Economist to describe the decline in Dutch manufacturing following the discovery and rapid exploitation of gas in the country. Ironically, the term first appeared in a 1977 article with the Dutch case in mind, but the phenomenon it revealed was actually already occurring in Venezuela at that same time, and it may realistically have equally been called the Venezuelan virus when it was first described. In short, Venezuela's economy became so dependent on oil that it became closely tied to the market price of the resource, and therefore heavily influenced by world events which could cause that price to rise and to fall. That is precisely what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. First, in the 1970s, Venezuela experienced a significant economic boost. The 1973 Yom Kippur War and the 1979 Iranian Revolution heavily reduced oil supplies coming out of the Middle East. While this led to massive energy shortages in many parts of the world, it was great news for Venezuela, which profited handsomely from the resulting rise in the market price of oil. However, the period also saw corruption and oil money embezzlement reach its zenith. The Venezuelan NGO Pro Calidad de Vida estimated in 1997 that around $100 billion in oil funds were wasted or stolen by Venezuelan officials during this period. Moreover, the 1980s wouldn't be nearly as kind to Venezuela. The start of the decade saw oil prices come crashing down, and Venezuela's economy came crashing with it, to the extent that Venezuela was forced to seek foreign loans to keep afloat. With quality of life in Venezuela tanking as a result of the crash, public dissatisfaction with the existing government grew and reached a boiling point in 1989. The so-called Caracazo was an explosion of unrest on the streets of Caracas and other Venezuelan cities after the government of center-left President Carlos Andrés Pérez announced a slew of austerity measures intended to secure a bailout loan from the IMF. When the protests were met with a brutal government crackdown, resulting in the deaths of possibly up to several thousand people, the credibility of the government disappeared entirely and people began to yearn for change. It was in this climate of strife that Hugo Chavez Frias, a soldier in the Venezuelan army with leftist leanings, sensed a bit of an opportunity. Chavez attempted a coup d'etat in 1999, which was unsuccessful and for which he ended up in prison. However, his image of a sort of Venezuelan Robin Hood vying for the good of the people was born, and following his release, he was ultimately elected president of Venezuela in 1999. Chavez's presidency of Venezuela is looked at differently by different people. Depending on political orientation, the 14 years of so-called Chavismo may be described as revolutionary, transformative, authoritarian, charitable, oppressive, and a whole lot more. There is no doubt that Chavez's social programs helped lift a lot of Venezuelans out of poverty, and his government provided benefits to Venezuelans that had not been provided to them until then by a state which didn't really depend on the citizens' tax money. However, Chavez also ensured strict control over the freedom of the press and progressively eliminated political plurality in Venezuela. He also weakened the judiciary and withdrew from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, an international criminal court with jurisdiction over practically all of Latin America. Chavez also squashed private enterprise and nationalized private businesses, including those providing services of great importance to the citizens, something that put Venezuela into having even more dependence on its imports. Venezuela's public debt also rose by almost 300% during his presidency. Perhaps above all, though, Chavez did nothing to change the dependence of Venezuela on its central resource of oil. When employees of the state-run oil company PDVSA went on strike in 2002, Chavez responded by firing over 19,000 oil industry workers, something which caused Venezuela's oil-producing ability to contract. Moreover, Chavez also didn't set any money aside in a sovereign wealth fund to insulate Venezuela against the falls in oil price, which could be so critical for its monolithic economy, as he would well have known given the events of the Caracazo, which kick-started his ascent to power. In short, all these elements made the next looming economic crisis in Venezuela many times more disastrous than it otherwise would have been. By the time that crisis hit, Chavez had done something which meant he would not foot any of the blame for what was coming. He died. After his death from cancer in early 2013, the reins of the state wound up in the palms of Maduro, who'd been serving as his vice president since the previous year. And it would be only over the course of the following year that the full force of Venezuela's problems would erupt and Venezuela would buckle under the pressure. Tragically, the economic crisis, which had struck Venezuela in the late 1980s and had resulted in the Caracazo protests, was actually small time in comparison with the crisis which struck Venezuela just after Chavez died. The 2013 Venezuelan crisis was, on a national level, more disastrous even than the fall of the Soviet Union and the Great Depression. Oil prices fell, and Venezuela's exposed economy, by now dependent on oil for 90% of its revenue, just crumbled. As defaults rose, foreign lenders stopped issuing loans to Venezuelans. Due to its massive borrowing, Venezuela was not in a position to continue importing everyday goods as it had been doing before. The cost of essential commodities skyrocketed, hyperinflation took hold, and the value of the Venezuelan bolivar, the national currency, plummeted overnight. Millions of Venezuelans fled abroad, and by 2020, the Marshall Center reported millions of Venezuelans were seeking temporary refuge in neighboring South American countries, with around 1.8 million Venezuelans sheltering in Colombia alone. Throughout this, Maduro stood impotent and simply continued the tried and tested autocrat's tactic of clinging to power as the country weltered around him. Massive protests had broken out immediately in the wake of Chavez's death, and these only grew as hyperinflation struck Venezuela and the price of everyday commodities reached astounding levels. However, Maduro continued to enjoy the support of the military, something which would prove crucial in the context of the spiraling economic situation. The protests were, resultingly, brutally put down under the new leader's orders. Understandably, the Venezuelan public had not taken to their new leader, and within 1 year of taking office, as the country crumbled under the dire economic conditions, Maduro's approval rating stood at a paltry 25%. It is partly this very visible lack of popularity which made Maduro's re-election as president in 2018 appear highly dubious. Officially, Maduro won re-election with around 67% of the vote. The Venezuelan opposition, however, disputed the result of the election and declared the results illegitimate, further claiming that this made President of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, the interim president. This was supported by the United States, which refused to recognize the official victory of the elections by Maduro and instead recognized Guaido as president, a position shared at some point by around 60 other countries, including most of the EU. This immediately left the Venezuelan dictator in a sort of limbo. Crippling sanctions were introduced against the government, which only added to the failing economy, mass emigration, and large-scale protests. With the inflation rate still spiraling, sanctions against the country, a united opposition, and diaspora, it may have appeared like the socialist government of Venezuela in the absence of Hugo Chavez might be on its last legs. Now you might ask, why was Chavez's popularity in Venezuela so high while Maduro's had, since the outset, always been so low? Well, the answer to that is pretty complicated, and it likely spans a number of explanations. However, suffice to narrow it down to the fact that Chavez had 3 things on his profile that Maduro does not really have. The first was charisma. Chavez was well-liked. He was a swashbuckling fellow. He could be recalled singing mariachi ballads at public events. In contrast, Maduro is stiff, sullen, and awkward. Chavez had also been a paratrooper in the Venezuelan military, and his Rambo-style coup d'etat had earned him a reputation as a folk hero, while Maduro had started life as a bus driver and had not entered power with anything close to the same political acumen that Chavez had. Secondly, Chavez, through his public programs, had a number of PR victories on his profile that Maduro did not. His spending on social programs, targeting the elimination of poverty and mass education projects, painted his regime as a friend of the people and a force for good, while quietly masking the targeting of foreign companies, which helped sustain Venezuela's GDP, as well as a complete inability to diversify the one-dimensional Venezuelan economy. It didn't help that Chavez had spent big on social problems designed to improve the living situation of everyday Venezuelans, which they did, but these programs were only sustainable insofar as the price and demand for Venezuela's oil remained relatively stable. And that brings us to the third element that Chavez profited from and Maduro didn't. And that was simple luck. Just as before, the economy of Venezuela under Chavez remained entirely tied to oil. Yet practically the entirety of Chavez's reign was punctuated by a high demand for oil, especially in the early 2000s when China began buying up Venezuelan oil hand over fist. As Charles Shapiro, former US ambassador to Venezuela, told the Wharton School of Business, quoting, "In many ways, Hugo Chavez was the luckiest guy in the world. When Chavez became president, Venezuelan oil sold for $8 a barrel. It reached $140 at one point and was around $115 or so when he died and Maduro began his tenure." One analyst took it a step further, remarking to Al Jazeera, quoting again, "The biggest sucker in Venezuelan history is the guy who is going to follow Chavez as president." In essence, almost none of the economic success that Venezuela experienced under Chavez can be attributable to any economic mastery. In contrast, much of the misery experienced by Venezuela after his death can be directly attributed to a severe lack of foresight by Chavez and his government while he was in power. You see, rather than see the past economic failures of Venezuela as the result of corruption and lack of diversification of Venezuelan industries that it had been, Chavez instead decided to point the finger of blame at the capitalist and neoliberal entities he claimed were taking advantage of Venezuelan resources for their own benefit. Correspondingly, he made sure to impose disfavorable conditions upon those who would seek to exploit Venezuela's oil and resolutely refused to replace it with a domestic apparatus for refining the oil, something that in Venezuela's case was badly needed. Chavez focused his energy instead on solidifying his rule over Venezuela through an iron grip, earning himself the nickname Hugo Boss from the Journal of Foreign Policy in 2006, while continuing social programs intended to secure relatively good graces from the Venezuelan people. Now, while Maduro was not responsible for the mess that was left to him by Chavez and his predecessors, he was responsible for how his administration would react to that mess. And that, as it turned out, was to commit the exact same pattern of authoritarian behavior pursued by his mentor, suppressing political freedom and sabotaging Venezuela's economic prospects by chasing away foreign corporations. All this interspaced with a healthy dose of anti-American, anti-neoliberal rhetoric. But Maduro did make one move, which was entirely his own, which even Chavez had not put forward as a realistic plan of action by Venezuela, and which catapulted Venezuela into the world's attention in late 2023, and that was to threaten to invade and annex the territory of a sovereign nearby nation. We're talking, of course, about Venezuela's claims to the Essequibo region of Guyana, along with its resources. Now, the Essequibo topic is something that we've actually already covered here on Mora Graphics, and so we're not going to devote too much time to the subject today. You can watch that video if you want to. But there is one additional thing to understand about Venezuela's oil in the context of the Essequibo, and that's not just its abundance, but also its quality. In very broad terms, oil can be measured in terms of both its lightness, with lighter oil requiring much less difficulty in extraction than heavy oil, and the presence of certain chemical impurities, such as sulfur. A common measure for the weight of crude oil is the American Petroleum Institute Gravity Index, or API. Oil with a high API will move easily from the reservoir to the producing well. Meanwhile, low sulfur means that the oil will be less corrosive on the producing well and thus reduce the cost of refining it. According to McKinsey, Venezuelan crude oil has an API between 16 and 30, whereas the Saudi range is between 28 and 51. This means that Venezuela's oil requires a much more intensive operation to refine it, a procedure requiring specialist knowledge and on-site access to the oil site, which Venezuela, under Chavez and Maduro, became rather unwilling to provide. And as you might have suspected by now, the oil found in Guyana in 2015 is considered to be of very high quality, being both of a high API and quite low in sulfur. This, in addition to the other resources offered by the Essequibo region, as pointed out in our other video on the topic, is many times more alluring to Venezuela's iridescent posturing than it would have normally been. So, what's next for Venezuela under Maduro? Well, unfortunately for Venezuelans, it doesn't look like Maduro is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. In the years since the turbulent beginning of his presidency, Maduro has done little to improve the state of the economy, but continued to make moves which have further isolated Venezuela dramatically and increased sanctions upon it. Maduro has regularly bashed the US and its allies and hampered ties with the EU, whose ambassador to Venezuela was expelled in 2021. Meanwhile, the currency in Venezuela continued its runaway inflation in the years since 2013, with $1 being valued at around 4 million bolivars in 2021, although Maduro's administration did provide a remedy to this problem by simply chopping off several zeros and reintroducing the bolivar as a new currency every couple of years. Maduro also made no attempt to stem the flow of people leaving Venezuela, resulting in the massive decline in the Venezuelan population mentioned at the beginning of this video. He has, however, despite the overwhelming opposition to his rule, made some moves intended to ensure his political survival. One of these was to target Juan Guaido, freezing his assets and forcing him ultimately into exile in the US. This did somewhat work, as the opposition chose quietly to drop its backing of him, and even the EU downscaled its description of him from the rightful president of Venezuela to, quote, privileged interlocutor working towards a democratic future for Venezuela. But Maduro has been making strides to consolidate some friends in the region and abroad, chiefly for his own benefit. In February, he welcomed Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of his longtime ally Russia, who reaffirmed his country's support for the Venezuelan leader. Maduro has also sought to coax support from other left-leaning political leaders in the region, traveling to Brazil to meet leftist President Lula, having been banned from entering Brazil by its president Jair Bolsonaro in 2019, and ostentatiously backing Mexico in a very public diplomatic row with Ecuador by withdrawing Venezuelan diplomats from the country. Maduro's grip on power over the last few years has also been dealt a boost by the, at times, abject disorganization of the Venezuelan opposition, which dropped its support for Juan Guaido and regularly failed to streamline its representation at even local elections. But there may be a chance for some change at the coming election. With the next presidential election scheduled for the summer of 2024 this year, the opposition has chosen former diplomat Edmundo Gonzalez as the main opposition candidate, and as Reuters reported, he has been polling well at around 46% of the vote, with only 21% claiming that they would back Maduro, according to that same poll. However, if recent history has shown us anything, it is one thing for a dictator to be unpopular, and it is another thing entirely for him to actually be unseated. Who knows what will become of Venezuela in the coming months and years, but if anything is truly to change for the Venezuelan people, it may be more than just a change of head of state, which is necessary.